but they are also the very reason why we are no longer in government. So we need to really get to grips with why populism is becoming a very dominant force in a number of political systems around the world. And if we look at the history of populism, maybe bypassing the early days of American populism back in the 19th century, but more on the 20th century, where I think the word populism becomes widely known in the Latin American context. We see very clearly that the golden age of populism usually coincides with economic problems or crises, and also an economic structure that leads to inequality. The rise of populism we see very clearly, first of all, after the Great Depression, and then again, maybe in the 90s, 80s and 90s, where countries were beginning to experience problems as they were unable to control the damaging effects from perhaps an excessively deregulated or liberalized economic regimes. We need to consider these factors very seriously, because I believe that these conditions will become more and more common. Partly because the global economy is likely to go through more and more volatile periods. That is now the nature of a globalized economic system. And this volatility often leads to crises, financial, economic, and then often leading to social and political crises around the world. And when there is discontent, when people are suffering from economic downturns or depressions, they look for quick fixes, they look for simple solutions. At the same time, we have to recognize also that the current economic structure, particularly the way the market system works, is going to reward winners, is going to lead to a number of losers at a particular time. This leads to inequality, this leads to discontent, and this leads to people who are opportunistic at the political leadership level to exploit such discontent. And it's always easy to whip up sentiments that people are not doing well because others are actually doing well at their expense. This is why we begin to see the rise of populism again. And we should recognize that in the past, populism and populist trends have cut across ideologies. They could be left-wing, right-wing, or they could happen in developed countries, developing countries. They could arise in democracies as well as authoritarian regimes. Usually, as I said, because we have an opportunistic political leader who appeals to emotions, who plays on the feeling of discontent arising from economic hardship or economic inequality. And I think the problems today are compounded by the fact that the ICT revolution, the information and communications technological revolution, has changed the way people live. We have far less time for deliberation. People are bombarded with information every day. So it is extremely difficult to start a meaningful political dialogue in terms of policy formulation. Political competition gets reduced to very simple slogans with quick fixes appealing to voters' aspirations. And this has been made more difficult by the fact that modern political campaigns are also very much dominated by people who are experts at marketing and also professional strategists or consultants that would recommend policies that win elections rather than policies that deliver longer-term prosperity. The experience of Thailand certainly fits into this analysis. For a long time in Southeast Asia, this region was seen as a model in terms of economic development. When Latin America were going through a crisis due to the excesses of populism, this region was seen as a region that has discipline, fiscally and monetary discipline, as well as the ability to obtain high growth with stability. But the 97 crisis that affected Thailand, Indonesia, and Korea first, and then the region as a whole, changed the political game, certainly in Thailand. A populist leader basically took advantage or exploited the suffering that people went through during that financial crisis and began to offer excessive populist policies, thereby obtaining popularity, and was able to remain in power for a considerable period of time. The political dialogues that used to take place changed in nature. And as we mentioned during the last election, the campaign basically deteriorated into situations of simple slogans and parties now trying to outbid each other in terms of coming out with populist policies. People do not yet see the potential damage that this could do. It does take some time before the populist policies work through and lead to the kind of damages that many of us here recognize and can see ahead of time. First of all, it will take some time to undo some of the strong foundations as far as the fiscal and monetary situation is concerned. Thailand, for instance, we are now running budget deficits. The government will be undertaking a number of special borrowing from external as well as internal sources, but it will be some time before the fiscal or monetary situation deteriorate considerably to lead to perhaps another economic or financial crisis. But if we look at history, we see clearly how big the damage this could do. In Latin America, for instance, Argentina used to rank 6th as far as GDP or the size of its economy is concerned. But after several rounds of populist policies, the country found itself ranked 88th. Moreover, despite the appeal to poor and disadvantaged people, populist policies in the past, in all other places, have proven not to actually provide solutions for those very people. Rather, the poor become even more dependent on the state, which finds itself unable to deliver the promises that it has made. And it also leads to other damages in the political system. Populism and populist policies usually also come with opportunities for corruption because of excessive state intervention. And the culture of dependency that it creates also destroys the very concepts of individual choice and freedom, which must be the strongest foundations for a liberal democracy and a good functioning market system. Worst of all, populist policies are also associated with increasing social conflicts, as groups of people are pitted against one another for political purposes, and this could even lead to political violence. For Thailand, we are now extremely concerned with what the government is doing in terms of its pursuit of populist policies. Apart from what I now call the infamous rice scheme, which becomes better and better known around the world, we also have a number of populist policies also currently at work. By the end of this year, the minimum wage might see a doubling of its rate in some provinces in Thailand. We also have schemes for first car buyers. We have schemes for a number of funds that are being set up that gives out loans, mostly maybe for consumption in the country. And the damages that we begin to see are becoming clearer and clearer, but perhaps not for the people who directly benefit from these policies at first. Here, who is here with me, will probably talk a lot more about the rice scheme, but basically a policy that is buying up rice from farmers at roughly about 20 to 30% above market price means that the government becomes the sole trader of rice. Already it is expected that Thailand will lose our status as the #1 exporter of rice this year because the government is holding all the stock of rice at prices that are far above the market price, and therefore it cannot export the rice successfully. We're also seeing quite a considerable burden being placed on government banks that are running this scheme and will eventually be fiscalized, causing about 100 billion baht of taxpayers' money every year. We also see rampant corruption taking place as state agencies are involved from the stages of buying rice from farmers to actually managing that stock, as well as actually eventually selling those rice at a loss. And yet, the government is continuing its policy. It is whipping up sentiments of farmers, saying that anybody who opposes these policies are basically trying to keep farmers poor, which will eventually lead to even more conflicts in a political environment in Thailand that you already know have been set back by severe political conflict over the last few years. And as we look at these trends and we look at the past, we see the clear dangers of how this might end. If you look at the experience, whether in Latin America, whether in Europe, or other regions of the world that have gone through these populist phases, we can see at least 3 types of very unhappy endings. First, for many countries, this leads to the loss of democracy, or liberal democracy. First of all, governments that run populist policies become more and more authoritarian as they control more and more of the resources of the country and also try to silence the opposition. And then eventually, when this becomes more and more severe, there is a strong backlash or reaction. And this has led in a number of countries to coup d'etats, military intervention, which then come in to try to fix the problem, fare no better at managing the economy, return the countries to elections and then to populist regimes. We've seen these kinds of cycles in a number of regions around the world. A second type, I guess, of an unhappy ending basically requires some kind of foreign intervention. When the economy can no longer sustain itself, maybe the IMF gets called in. For countries in Europe now that are now suffering from past excesses, it's the European Union that will have to be dictating their economic policies. And it could be argued that in Latin American or Central American, even some North American country, the populist trend had to be stopped by maybe an intervention from a superpower, maybe not explicitly, but also certainly they played an important role in trying to contain the populist trends. But a third unhappy ending, of course, is the collapse of the economy itself. Loss of opportunities and prosperity, loss of competitiveness, and worst of all, the destruction of the aspirations and hopes that the people whom these populist policies were meant to serve themselves. Can we avoid these unhappy endings? That is the real challenge for all of us here who believe in economic freedom and who believe in liberal democracy. I said at the beginning that I don't have the answers, but I do think that there are some vital ingredients that must be put in place to fight populism and to try to get